Hello all out there in YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Horror Talk, the show that gives me an excuse to ramble on and on about the horror genre, hopefully in a coherent way. If it's incoherent, I hope it at least is entertaining. As you can see, I'm not in my normal location right now. That's because I'm taking care of this fluffy girl named Sadie. She's one of my favorite clients. So yeah, I'm dog-sitting her for a little while, so I thought I would take the opportunity to film an idea for a horror talk that I thought would be kind of fun. So, as you can see by the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about Grindhouse movies for beginners. Now, that's not entirely true. I'm going to be talking about exploitation films for beginners, but Grindhouse sounds cooler than exploitation. And I can hear a lot of you asking, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between a Grindhouse movie and an exploitation movie? Not a lot, actually. But there is a little bit of a difference. For a movie to be considered a Grindhouse movie, it mostly has to have had a theatrical run in America. And there are a lot of foreign exploitation films that aren't technically Grindhouse movies because they never really got a theatrical run here. There are some that did, so they would qualify as Grindhouse movies, but some of them did not, so they would not count as Grindhouse movies. And one of the big differences between something that is a Grindhouse movie as opposed to just an exploitation film is a Grindhouse movie usually didn't have a major studio backing it. A perfect example of this would be Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th. They're both exploitation films, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a Grindhouse movie. Friday the 13th is not a Grindhouse movie, because Friday the 13th had Paramount behind it. So I wanted to do this video as an introduction for people just getting into exploitation cinema, and, you know, for people who are looking for some movies, I'm gonna provide some here. I have 10 movies, but before we get into that, I want to talk about the main reason why I decided to do this video. Now, I had come across a few videos online of people talking about exploitation movies, and they say that exploitation movies are not their favorite genre. Which is fine. I mean, there's no issue with that. I understand that not everybody is going to like exploitation movies, and they're not everyone's taste. I completely understand that. But my issue was when they picked movies that they believed were a representation of all exploitation movies. And when they said, you know, like, when they said, you know, I don't like exploitation movies, they said, exploitation movies are films like I Spit on Your Grave, or a Serbian film, or Last House on the Left, or Martyrs. And while, yes, those are exploitation films, they are not a representation of exploitation cinema as a whole. They are a specific group of exploitation films. When it comes to exploitation cinema, there are many different genres, and we're going to get into more of those genres when I get into the top 10 here. But you had so many genres. Yes, you had horror movies, of course, but not every exploitation movie is a horror movie. And not every horror movie is an exploitation movie. You know, like The Omen, that's a horror movie, but it's not an exploitation movie. The Shining, horror movie, but not an exploitation movie. But you had many different genres. You had action movies, you had comedies, you had musicals, you had some exploitation films that were musicals. Yes, movies like I Spit on Your Grave and a Serbian film are exploitation movies, but they are a specific category of exploitation movies. They are shocksploitation. Shocksploitation is the category of exploitation cinema that includes the more extreme genres, like rape revenge movies, or the cannibal films, or the Nazi-sploitation movies, the torture movies, things of that nature. In those movies, things are a little more extreme, a little more graphic, and that's why they are in the shocksploitation genre. These 10 movies that I picked out, I did not pick any from the shocksploitation genre. And one fact is, a lot of exploitation films were rated PG. I'm not joking. You've heard me say this on my channel before. Back when the rating system was first created in 1968, there was no PG-13 rating. There was only, you had G, PG, and R, I believe. I think that's how it went. But anyway, so PG was essentially what PG-13 is now. It was that specific category, that specific rating meant, okay, yeah, there's gonna be stuff in here that might not be for kids, might not be for sensitive viewers. I have no problem if kids see violent movies. I mean, if they can handle it, by all means, let them. I saw violent movies when I was a kid, and maybe that's not a great example of that. But anyway, moving on. PG back then was what PG-13 is now, so there were a lot of exploitation movies that were PG. And of course, there were a lot of, R-rated exploitation movies. R was probably the most common rating for exploitation cinema. For people who don't know a lot about exploitation cinema, there are certain genres, and there are a lot of movies that you have seen and probably love that are exploitation movies. We'll get into the 10 movies in a minute, and I want to be clear here, this is not a top 10 list. These movies are not ranked in any way. This is not me saying, oh, these movies are better than these movies. These movies were just films that I thought would be good. They're the movies that I would pick for people who were just getting into exploitation films and they wanted to check some out. Before we get into the list, maybe we should explain what exploitation movies are. It's actually quite simple. Exploitation movies are movies that they didn't have a big budget, they didn't have a lot of big-name actors behind them. Some of them would. I mean, when major studios started getting into exploitation films, yes, you had big-name actors, but for the most part, they didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have big-named actors, but what they had were certain elements that you could exploit. The most common elements are things like, violence, nudity, sex. Those are things that would get asses in the seats. Anything that would make for an interesting poster or anything that would make for a good trailer that would get people to watch the movie. Basically, exploitation films exploited what audiences wanted to see. But it wasn't just those things, like it would be action. Okay, you wanted to see action. That would be something to exploit for the audiences. Rock and roll. There were quite a few rock and roll exploitation films, so they exploited rock and roll so that people could see that. You had the women in prison movies, which had a lot of sex and a lot of violence, so, that people would be able to see that. But there were other elements, and again, we'll get into that in the top 10 list. And there are, in many ways, there is a new era of exploitation films today. Think about it, okay? What do exploitation films do? They exploit what the audience wants to see. You have the new live-action Disney movies, the new Star Wars movies, the new Jurassic Park movies. Those are a new era of exploitation films. What are they exploiting? Nostalgia. They're nostalgia-sploitation. That's what I like to call those movies. Because, again, they're exploiting what audiences want to see. They're exploiting nostalgia. Nostalgia-sploitation. Anyway, I didn't want to pick any modern-day exploitation films. I wanted to stick to the glory days of exploitation cinema, like the 60s through the early 80s. So I'm going to try to stick in that area there. The way I decided to do this was, again, to prove that not all exploitation films are horror movies. I picked some non-horror exploitation films and some horror exploitation films. The way it's going to go is the odd numbers are going to be non-horror exploitation films, and the even numbers are going to be horror exploitation films. So, with that, let's get on to it. And we're picking specific subgenres for each one. And the subgenre we're going to start with, we're starting with the non-horror genre, martial arts movies. Back in the day when kung fu flicks and martial arts films were first coming out, one of the main reasons they were able to get such a huge audience here in the States is because of Grindhouse cinema and Grindhouse theaters. And again, you know, what did they exploit? Action. They exploited hand-to-hand combat action. Probably the most well-known when it comes to martial arts movies, especially older ones, are the Bruce Lee movies, especially Enter the Dragon. Enter the Dragon was one of the earliest kung fu films, and it's one of the big movies that grew the popularity of martial arts films here in America. But I didn't want to pick Enter the Dragon or any Bruce Lee movies because I thought that was a little too obvious of a choice. I mean, so many people know who Bruce Lee is, but there's a lot of great martial arts movies. You know, you had Master of the Flying Guillotine, Five Fingers of Death. I decided to go with a different martial arts film to put on this list. One from Japan. Now, the interesting thing is Japanese martial arts movies and Hong Kong martial arts movies are a little different. Japanese martial arts films were more weapons-based. They focused on more weapons-based martial arts, whereas in Hong Kong, they were more, you know, hand-to-hand martial arts and barehanded martial arts. But there was a movie, a martial arts movie from Japan that did not focus on weapons-based martial arts, and that was The Street Fighter. Not Street Fighter, not the video game. This came out way before the video game. The Street Fighter was starring Sonny Chiba, which was he was a big action star in Japan back in the day. He was considered the anti-Bruce Lee. Whereas Bruce Lee was always this upstanding citizen in his movies. He was more, you know, someone you could look up to. He was a very noble guy in his movies. Sonny Chiba played these, you know, these martial arts guys who were a little seedier. They were not as clean cut. And that's what you had in The Street Fighter. And you can see in The Street Fighter a lot of inspiration for the Street Fighter video game. But also, you can kind of see a little inspiration for Mortal Kombat. Yes, Sonny Chiba in this movie and the Street Fighter movies, you could tell they did heavily influence the Street Fighter video games, but watching the movie, Sonny Chiba would fit more in a Mortal Kombat game, because the fight sequences in this are very bloody. I mean, you know, he rips people's throats out, he fractures skulls with his bare hands. It's a really fun movie, and it's very violent. It got the X rating for violence back when it came out. But it's a lot of fun, and it works because Sonny Chiba is so charismatic. He is a bit of an asshole, but he's a noble asshole, if that makes any sense. It's hard to make a likable asshole in movies. You can do it, but it's not easy to do. It's not easy to make an asshole that you root for. But in this movie, Sonny Chiba, who plays a character named Terry is an asshole that you root for. And I think it is kind of because he's, you know, a little seedier than most people you see in other martial arts movies. He's not as honorable as characters from other martial arts movies. His idea is, if I'm in a fight, I'm going to do whatever I can to win that fight. He's not fighting in tournaments and stuff like that. He's fighting on the streets. He's fighting thugs and stuff like that. So yeah, that's my first choice for people just getting into exploitation cinema, a martial arts movie. Because there are a lot of martial arts fans out there, and there are a lot of people who like action movies, so martial arts films and kung fu films, they're a good place to start if you're just getting into exploitation films. So for the next choice, the number 2 choice, we're going to go with one of the most popular genres in exploitation cinema. Slasher movies. Slasher movies are exploitation films, and I don't need to tell you what those exploit. I mean, yeah, you go to a slasher movie for the kills, and there's that, you know, that whole cliche of if you show your tits, you're gonna die. So you have sex and gore in a lot of slasher movies. Not every slasher movie. There are some slasher movies that don't have a lot of nudity, and there are a couple that are actually rated PG. Tourist Trap is a perfect example of a slasher movie that's rated PG. A movie I talked about recently, Madhouse, starring Vincent Price and Peter Cushing, that came out in 1974. That was rated PG, and it's a slasher movie, and it has some very great kills, but there's no over-the-top violence or nudity. But that's not the one I'm going to recommend. I mean, you people out there, if you're on this channel, or you like exploitation films, or you like horror, you've seen a fair amount of slasher movies already. Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, you know, the most well-known ones. You could consider the Child's Play movies exploitation films, but they came out like in the late 80s, so that doesn't really fit my criteria here. You know, there's Prowler, the Prom Night, the hundreds of slasher films that came out in the early 80s. So it's hard to recommend one that people haven't already seen. The one that I'm picking, I'm guessing people have already seen. It's one of the most popular subcategories in slasher movies is the backwoods summer camp slasher. You know, Friday the 13th, obviously, you had The Burning, you had Sleepaway Camp, Just Before Dawn. That's not really a summer camp movie, but it does involve people camping in the woods and being attacked by some killers. But one of my favorite slasher movies, which I don't think gets enough credit, and it's my favorite summer camp slasher movie, and that is Madman. I think Madman is incredibly underrated, and I would recommend that to anybody who likes slasher movies. It has some awkward moments in it, but so do a lot of slasher movies from the 80s and the 70s. I mean, you know, look at Halloween. I mean, Halloween is considered one of the greatest slasher movies ever, and that has a lot of awkward moments in it. But people don't trash that one. I mean, and I'm a Halloween fan, and I say, hey, you know, if you're going to give this one a pass for its awkwardness, I mean, you should give Madman a pass for its awkwardness, because it's the same awkwardness that you see in many slasher movies. I mean, there's really nothing different between the awkwardness in Madman and the awkwardness in Friday the 13th or any other slasher movie. I think it's a very good slasher movie, and the main reason why I love it is its atmosphere. It has its gore, and it has the nude scenes and all that, of course, but it does have a great atmosphere. The movie feels like a campfire story that you tell around the campfire to kids, and I love that atmosphere. Out of all the summer camp slasher movies, this is the one that feels most like a campfire story, and for me that gives it a little more of a charm. And you have the killer, who is Madman Mars, who's a fantastic killer. One of the most underrated slashers out there. I'm a little disappointed that we didn't get any Madman sequels. You have all these people making Halloween fan films and Friday the 13th fan films. I want to see someone make a Madman fan film. You know, I want to see a Madman sequel, damn it. I mean, I love Madman. There was talks of a Madman sequel and a Madman reboot a while back being done by the original creators. They had a GoFundMe, but I don't think it made enough money, so I don't think we're ever going to get a Madman sequel. Madman, that's the slasher I would recommend. For its atmosphere, for its killer. I like the characters. They're that fun, quirky kind of characters that you get in most slasher movies. Give Madman a shot if you haven't seen it, and especially for people just getting into exploitation cinema, I think Madman's a good way to go. Now, we're going to move on to the number 3 spot, and the next subgenre we're going to go for is Blaxploitation. Now, Blaxploitation cinema, as you would guess, yes, okay, what it exploits there, it exploits what black audiences want to see. This came out, like, in the early 70s, you know. You had the civil rights movement going on. Martin Luther King had recently been assassinated. And the African American community, they wanted heroes. They wanted to see people on screen, you know, that they could identify with. Blaxploitation cinema might be one of the most important subgenres to modern film. Let me explain. It's not just because it gave black audiences heroes to root for, and that is important. But, in a way, blaxploitation movies saved Hollywood. Blaxploitation started during that transition period from the 60s into the 70s. The Vietnam War was going on. You just had the Manson family murders. It was a weird time because it felt like America was losing. People in America felt like they were losing. And Hollywood and movie production companies were failing. They weren't making as much money as they usually would. And things were getting bad. There was talks of pawning off Judy Garland's ruby slippers to get money for the studios because they weren't making money. And then the blaxploitation genre began, and it began with a movie called Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. Technically, it began before that with a movie called Cotton Comes to Harlem, which was the first official blaxploitation film, but that never gets the credit as being the first official blaxploitation film. The movies that get credit for starting the blaxploitation genre are Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song and Shaft. Now, these movies were made, especially Sweet Sweetback, it was made by a black filmmaker, made by black actors, and it was one made for the black community. And it was one of the, and this is a spoiler, it was one of the first movies where a black person lived. I mean, and again, spoilers for Night of the Living Dead, but in Night of the Living Dead you had the first black main character, and he died at the end. I mean, he died at the end of that movie. In Sweet Sweetback, the main character lives at the end, which black audiences hadn't seen before. And so now Hollywood and film production companies realized there was this audience that they were ignoring this entire time that they could make films for, and then they could use these films to make money and fund other projects. So the blaxploitation boom happened, and you had Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, which was an independent movie, and at the time it was the most profitable independent movie for back then. It made the most money of any independent movie for the time. And this got other people to, you know, start realizing, hey, you know, we can make money with not just blaxploitation, but exploitation cinema in general. And then you had the exploitation boom in the 70s. And that's, you know, so other people were making exploitation films with no money, and then those movies were making money, and then the movie studios realized, hey, if we make these small budget movies, we can make a profit, and then we can use that profit to fund bigger budget movies. And it all started with Sweet Sweetback and the blaxploitation movement. For the blaxploitation movies that I would recommend, I'm actually going to recommend 2, and the reason I'm doing that is because they have the same actress starring in both of them, and they were both directed by one of my favorite directors, Jack Hill. And that is Coffee and Foxy Brown, starring Pam Grier. Foxy Brown is a very important movie. Again, not just for Blaxploitation, not just for African Americans, but for women in general, when you think about it. Because a lot of times, especially with Coffee, and why I think Coffee was such an important movie, again, not just for the African American community, but women in general, because so many times when you have a woman in movies, especially someone who's a strong woman, they're rich, they're a skilled assassin, they're some, you know, they're a supermodel, they're higher class. Every time you see a woman in a movie, not just before Coffee came out, but you still see it after Coffee came out, they are of a higher class. They're sexy because they're in a higher class. But Coffee was a regular working person. She was a nurse. She was an average, everyday woman. And I like that because that showed so many people, hey, if this woman can be sexy and badass, so can I. But anyway, you know, Coffee is great because, and Foxy Brown. Coffee and Foxy Brown are so good. I have a hard time separating them because it's both Pam Grier, it's both Jack Hill, and Pam Grier is just so goddamn charismatic. I mean, she is, you know, just cool, she's tough, but she's also still vulnerable. She's someone who is strong, but there are times she's dealing with men who are physically stronger, so she has to use her brain to work around that. But she's still able to overcome all these obstacles, despite the fact that, you know, she's an average, everyday working person. Again, that's the main thing I love about Coffee, again, is because Coffee is a nurse, and she's still strong, she's still badass, she's still sexy, you know. She doesn't have to have a shit ton of money, she doesn't have to be some skilled assassin, she doesn't have to be perfect to be badass and sexy. So, highly, highly recommend Coffee and Foxy Brown if you're just getting into exploitation movies, especially Blaxploitation movies, and then go on from there. Once you watch Coffee and Foxy Brown, you're going to go down a rabbit hole of some really fun, entertaining movies. Okay, so moving on from that, we got the number 4 spot, which, again, a very popular horror genre, zombie movies. I've ranted and raved about zombie movies so many times on this channel. I've talked about how I used to be a zombie fan, but then I got worn out from the bombardment of zombie-related material that I just got sick of the genre. But there's still the zombie movies that I loved when I was a zombie fan, I still love now. And again, you know, okay, talking about what they exploit. Gore. You have people eating people. I mean, of course, you know exactly what it is. Seeing zombies get their heads blown off, seeing zombies eating people, you see, it's clear what they're exploiting there. But I mean, you had Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, all fantastic movies. Return of the Living Dead, which I recently did a review for, me shamelessly whoring myself out. But if I was going to recommend a movie to someone just getting into exploitation films, they've already seen the Romero movies. I mean, usually people who are fans of horror are the ones who go towards exploitation movies first. That's why, for a zombie movie, I want to pick one that isn't your typical zombie movie. Because people who are horror fans and they want to get into exploitation movies, they've already seen the Romero movies. So the zombie movie I decided to go for is Shivers. David Cronenberg's first movie. I absolutely love David Cronenberg. I love body horror. It is body horror, but it's a zombie movie where instead of somebody becoming a zombie because it spreads a virus, the zombie is a parasite. It's spread through this parasite. And instead of making people cannibals and want to eat people, it takes them down to the second basic human instinct. What are the two main animal instincts. Food and reproduction. Eating and sex. That's what happens in, Shivers. These parasites turn people into these crazy sex zombies. That sounds messed up, but that's only because it is. But it's a really, really good horror movie. I mean, it takes the idea of zombies that was created in Night of the Living Dead, takes this other spin on them, and it's graphic in a way. I mean, there's a lot of nudity. Yeah, of course you're going to see a lot of nudity in this. There's a lot of nudity, there's a fair amount of violence, but a lot of it is also suggested. There are times where you don't see the act happening, or the act happens, like, in a more suggested way. It's rated R. It is rated R, and it might even be rated X. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's at least rated R. But it's just really goddamn good. It's really strange in a good way. And for David Cronenberg's first movie, it's absolutely fantastic. I would put Shivers in my top 5 David Cronenberg movies. So if you're a fan of Cronenberg, and here's the main thing, Shivers was hard to find for years, but now I think it's finally been released on Blu-ray, so you can actually go watch it. Find a copy of Shivers, check it out. I guarantee that I don't want to say you won't be disappointed, but you're never going to forget it. I don't think you'll be disappointed, but I guarantee you're never going to forget it. So, okay, so that takes care of our number 4 spot. Now moving on to the number 5 choice. And the genre we're going to go with is the post-apocalyptic genre. It's okay, and again, to get on what this exploits the idea of the wasteland, exploits what would happen after an apocalypse. You know, watching society crumble and become savage again, basically. You know, of course you're going to have violence, you're going to have action, you're going to have nudity, in certain circumstances. The most well-known post-apocalyptic movies are the Mad Max movies. The original Mad Max wasn't so much a post-apocalyptic movie, it was a pre-apocalyptic movie. Society was on the verge of collapsing, and the first Mad Max took place around that area. Then you had the second Mad Max movie, Road Warrior, and that is a post-apocalyptic movie, and one of the most well-known and probably the most popular post-apocalyptic movie, until many people considered it overtaken by Mad Max Fury Road, done by the same director, so hey, it still works. But I didn't want to go with any of the Mad Max movies, because again, that's a little too predictable, and people have probably already seen the Mad Max movies. And then there's Beyond Thunderdome, which I don't hate. Anyway, moving on. The post-apocalyptic movie I decided to go for as a recommendation for people getting into exploitation films is my favorite post-apocalyptic movie, and that is A Boy and His Dog. It's really good. It's really different. You have this kid named Albert who goes around this wasteland. It takes place after the 4th World War. A lot of post-apocalyptic movies take place after the 3rd World War. This one takes place after the 4th World War. And of course, you would expect Earth has become a wasteland, and you have this kid named Albert who pals around with this dog named Blood. And here's the interesting thing. Albert and Blood have a psychic connection, so they can communicate with each other in their minds. Blood is a fantastic dog actor. A lot of people, when they think of dogs, they're like, oh, I want somebody like Lassie, I want someone like Rin Tin Tin. I'll take a dog like Blood any day of the week, especially if I can have a psychic connection with him and we can talk. Albert and Blood go around the wasteland looking for, again, the main things of survival. Food, water, and reproduction. This movie, again, it's not graphic, but it's a very cruel world. You have men looking for women because they are looking for sex. Now, that's fucked up, but this is a fucked up world. This is a post-apocalyptic movie where society has collapsed. It's a very cruel world. So you're going to have people, a lot of people in society, who are going to just try to fulfill their needs. Food, water, and their other needs. You never actually see it happening in certain cases. Sexual assault. That's what we're talking about. You never actually see it happen, but it is suggested in certain aspects. And again, that's because this is a very savage world. But it goes in a completely different direction in the second act, and I don't want to spoil it here. But it's a great post-apocalyptic movie, and it's a very influential post-apocalyptic movie. This came out before Mad Max, and it heavily inspired Mad Max. If you're out there, and again, I don't know too much about video games, but I do know about the Fallout video games. I had a friend who used to play them all the time. And if you like the Fallout games, you should watch A Boy and His Dog, because again, it heavily inspired Fallout. It was a major influence on a lot of post-apocalyptic movies, and that's why I highly recommend people check out A Boy and His Dog. It's based off of a book, and apparently it was supposed to be made into a series, which never happened, and that's unfortunate, because it's a very interesting movie, a very well-done movie, and you have the character of Blood, who is a great character. He's a great dog character, a great dog actor, one of the best dog actors, too. So yeah, I would highly recommend A Boy and His Dog. What do you think about that, Sadie? I can respect that. So that was the number 5 spot, and now we're going to move on to the number 6 recommendation, and that subgenre is Ecoterror. Ecoterror is basically Nature Strike Back movies. A lot of animal attack movies in this genre. You know, any movie where people are being attacked by animals, they fall into this genre. But again, to clarify, not all horror movies are exploitation movies, because the greatest animal attack movie ever is Jaws, but that's not an exploitation movie. But, you know, there's a lot of great ones out there. You know, Piranha is fantastic, Grizzly is great, Orca is great. So many killer animal movies were made as rip-offs of Jaws, but they're still very well done. And I almost thought about picking a Jaws rip-off, but I decided to go a different route because I've been picking a lot of exploitation movies that are rated R, but I thought, you know what, I should pick one that is rated PG. So, an animal attack movie, and again, okay, looking at what it exploits, you're seeing animals attack people, because that's fun. Admit it, okay? It's fun to see people getting attacked and eaten by animals. Whether you're a meat eater and or you're somebody who is a vegetarian, yes, humans are at the top of the food chain, but admit it, sometimes it's fun to see humans get brutalized by animals. Come on, it's entertaining to watch. So the Ecoterror movie I decided to pick, I wanted to pick one that came out before Jaws. And the one I decided to go for is Willard. Most people know about the, I think it was 2006 remake of Willard, but not a lot of people know that that was a remake. There was an original Willard that came out in 1971, and it's a PG horror movie. And there is a sequel called Ben, which I'll talk about another time, but let's stick with the original Willard. The movie Willard is kind of like Carrie, but again, it came out before Carrie. You have Willard, who is an outcast, and he's mistreated by a lot of people, but at the same time, he befriends a colony of rats. And he grows this friendship with so many rats, and he ends up being able to train these rats, and he develops a bond with these rats. And then as the movie goes along, he uses these rats to get revenge on the people who wronged him. Just like Carrie. I mean, in Carrie, she has a She has telekinesis, but again, she's an outcast. She uses that telekinesis to get revenge on people. Willard came out first, and it's about somebody, in this case it's rats, but he uses his connection with the rats to get revenge on people who wronged him. And again, this is an animal attack movie that came out before Jaws, and in a way it did set the stage for Jaws, because Willard was a pretty decent success when it came out. It's a descent into madness movie, and you're watching Willard descend into madness as he just keeps getting kicked down again and again and again by life, that he eventually snaps and uses his rat friends to get revenge on the people who wronged him. Very well done, and again, rated PG, but it's a PG movie with balls because it came out in the 70s. Very good killer animal movie, very good killer rat movie. It's just a lot of fun. And now, for the number 7th spot, we're going into this pretty niche genre, Carsploitation movies. Naturally, okay, it's obvious. Exploiting cars. Not just the cars, but it exploits car stunts, car chases, car crashes. That's what Carsploitation exploits. And there's some great ones. Death Race 2000, so much fun. Probably my favorite Carsploitation movie. There's Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, which is this great chase movie. But I decided to go with the original Gone in 60 Seconds. Guarantee a lot of you out there know about the Nicolas Cage Gone in 60 Seconds, but there was an original that came out in the 70s. The original Gone in 60 Seconds. Now, in the original Gone in 60 Seconds, the cars are the main characters. You're watching the movie for the cars, not so much for the people doing the heists. The movie is about this group of people who have to carjack a shit ton of cars in a very short amount of time. And that's about it. It's a very simple plot. It was made by stuntmen, and the reason these stuntmen wanted to make this movie is because they wanted to showcase their stunts. Now, the entire movie is a build-up to the last 40 minutes where you get a 40-minute car chase. And there are so many car crashes in this, there are so many stunts. It is one of the greatest chase sequences, car chase sequences, ever put on film. And it was the first time anybody ever really did anything like this. This was the first car movie, I believe, that had a jump. That had a car, like, jump off a ramp and do that thing. It was a small jump, but for back then it was a big deal because I do believe it was the first time anybody ever attempted something like this. And the thing that is a little crazy about this is Gone in 60 Seconds is a movie where they didn't get permits to do this stuff. So there are some pedestrians in this movie who are running out of the way of the cars, and they were really in danger. It's a very irresponsible movie. It's almost as irresponsible as the movie Roar, which we'll get into at another time, but it's an insane car chase at the end, and again, it's like a 40-minute long car chase, and it's great. It goes by very quickly. I mean, it takes a little while to get to that spot, but again, you're watching it for the cars. And you get some entertaining carjacking hijinks before that. But the movie has no real story. It's just people stealing cars, and the purpose of the story is to get to that 40-minute car chase at the end. But I do highly recommend it. Now for the number 8 spot. So we got 3 more spots left here, and in the number 8 spot, I wanted to recommend an Ozploitation film, or an Ozploitation film. Australia, they had this era of filmmaking that was very similar to the Italian filmmaking style, very similar to the Asian filmmaking style, where it was like the Wild West. You know, you had people doing crazy stunts, there was a lot of nudity, a lot of action, violence, and sex, and done with very little money. Ozploitation, or Australian exploitation, is so much fun, and it really needs to be seen to be believed. You had great action movies, you had great horror movies, you had a lot of sexploitation movies, and things got really saucy in those movies. But since this is a horror movie spot, I wanted to pick a horror movie. And I'm actually picking a more subdued Ozploitation film. One that's a little more atmospheric. It doesn't have a lot of violence. There is nudity in it, but it's more of an atmospheric one. It's more about suspense. And that is Patrick. One of my favorite Australian horror movies. In America, you had Carrie. In Australia, you had Patrick. Because Patrick is relatively the same story. It's about a guy with telekinesis, or, you know, he has mind powers. But the difference here is Patrick is in a coma. Patrick murdered his family, murdered his parents, but as a result of murdering his parents, he was he was injured as well, and he went into a coma. So, he's in a coma. He is, you know, lying in bed the entire movie with his eyes wide open. It's like there's something going on where they can't close his eyes. I guess there is a glue that you can use to close somebody's eyes who's in a coma, but I guess it's not working in this case, so his eyes are always open. And so the entire movie you have this guy just staring and lying down, and he's still able to have a creepy presence, because again, he has telekinesis. So he's able to control people's minds, he's able to move objects on their own. It's really creepy because I like horror movies that do creepy things in the background, or they do creepy things like in an area where you don't notice it at first, but then you notice it and it makes the scene that much more creepy. That happens a lot in Patrick, and it's this constant build-up. You could call Patrick a slow burn, but again, it's a slow burn done well. I mean, everything's building through the movie to the big scary moment, or the big, you know, scary climax, but you know, you have plenty of little creepy things here and there. And there's one scene, I don't want to spoil it here, but it's one scene where something so simple is done, but the way it's handled is creepy. I remembered watching it and I actually said, holy shit, when it happened, but it's a very simple thing that somebody does, but it's not handled in a very creepy way. If you like Carrie, I think you'll like Patrick. Don't expect as big of a body count as Carrie, but it is very well done, so highly, highly recommend Patrick. And now we're down to my last two spots. And for my last two spots, I'm a fan of Italian exploitation. If you're on this channel, you know I'm a fan of Italian exploitation. That's why I wanted to save these last two spots for, say it with me now, French movies. Yeah, sorry, terrible joke. I'm saving these last two spots for Italian exploitation. For the number 9 spot, I wanted to pick a movie from a very popular genre in Italian exploitation, and that is Eurocrime or polizieschi. I talked about this a little in my review of Almost Human, again me shamelessly whoring myself out. Eurocrime movies were cop and gangster films that took place in Italy during the 70s. And I've said this before, Italian film production companies always insisted that their filmmakers make movies that were like popular American films. So if you were going to make a movie in Italy back then, it had to be like another movie. Cop and gangster movies were becoming popular in America, so they started making cop and gangster movies in Italy. But again, even though they had to make movies that were like popular American movies, they always managed to make them their own. Some Italian rip-off movies are more blatant rip-offs than others, but there are quite a few that are able to stand on their own. And that was especially the case with Eurocrime. I was debating on what Italian crime thriller to go with, because there's so many great ones. Street Law is probably my favorite, and it's so good. It's sort of an Italian Death Wish, but it actually came out a little before Death Wish. But again, still very good. Italian Connection, one of my all-time favorites, and a movie that was actually a heavy influence on Quentin Tarantino when creating characters in Pulp Fiction. If you watch The Italian Connection, you'll know when you see it. You'll see two characters, and you'll know where Quentin Tarantino got the idea from. But the Polizieschi that I'm recommending is a movie called Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man. And the reason I'm recommending Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man is because that's the first Eurocrime movie I ever saw. And the reason I wanted to watch it is because of the man who directed it, Ruggero Deodato. Now, Ruggero Deodato is most famous for Cannibal Holocaust, one of the most notorious cannibal films ever made, and considered by many to be one of the most controversial and most disturbing movies ever made. I am a fan of Cannibal Holocaust. I think it's a legitimately effective horror movie. I don't agree with the animal cruelty, we'll just get that out of the way, but I think it's a good movie. But not a lot of people know that he directed this Italian crime thriller. Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man. Very simple plot. Well, actually not that simple of a plot. The police organization hires two guys who are kind of... They're very close to becoming criminals themselves. But what happens is these people were hired by the police, and they find out about crimes before they're going to be committed. So they find out people who are going to commit these crimes, and then they go and they are not that nice to the people who are about to commit those crimes. They're essentially thugs hired by the police. But it's a very fun exploitation film, very fun action movie, and it's, again, an example of the guerrilla style that Italian filmmakers had to deal with, because Italian filmmakers did not always get permission to film where they were filming. They had to, you know, they were given a short amount of time to film these movies, so they had to pick a location and film there. And Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man opens with this fantastic motorcycle chase. And again, they did not have permission to do this, so what they did was they filmed this motorcycle chase around Rome. They would film some scenes until the cops were called on them, and then they'd leave there and film in another location until the cops were called again, and then they leave there to film. It's actually pretty insane, but it's a really good motorcycle chase, and it's just a fun action movie. So I would highly recommend Live Like a Cop, Die Like a Man. And we're ending this list, the number 10 spot, with an Italian horror movie. Italian horror movie is one of my favorite... Italian horror movies it's one of my favorite genres, if not my favorite genre. I absolutely love Italian horror movies, and I wanted to end this list with an Italian horror movie. I'm a huge Lucio Fulci fan. You've seen me review quite a few of his movies on this channel. Lucio Fulci is one of my all-time favorite directors. But I didn't want to just pick a Fulci movie because I talk about him a lot on this channel, and I'm going to talk about him a lot more. So I almost went with him, but I decided not to. And then I realized a guy who I've been really neglecting on this channel is Dario Argento. Dario Argento is the reason I got into Italian horror. My first Italian horror movie I ever saw was Opera, which I would like to talk about sometime. If you're interested, please let me know. But anyway, I watched Opera, and then the second Italian horror movie I ever watched was Suspiria, and then I was hooked. And then I went on this journey into Italian horror years ago. I mean, back when I think I was still in high school when I started getting into Italian horror. But anyway, and so my love for Italian horror is because of Dario Argento. He's not my favorite director, but I do love him, and he's definitely up there when it comes to Italian directors for me. since I've been neglecting him so much on this channel, I should pick one of his movies as my recommendation for someone just getting into Italian exploitation. I did not pick Suspiria, just because I think it's a little too well known for this list here. It's hard to pick a Dario Argento movie that isn't well known, because he is probably the most well-known Italian horror director. Him, Fulci, and Mario Bava probably the most well-known Italian horror directors. But you know, I figured, yeah, I will still pick one. And if I'm going to pick an Argento movie, I'm going to pick a giallo movie, because giallo movies are the most well-known subgenre in Italian horror. There are quite a few subgenres in Italian horror, but giallo is definitely the most notorious. But I wanted to go with what is my favorite Argento giallo movie, and that is Bird with the Crystal Plumage. It was his first giallo movie, and Bird with the Crystal Plumage was one of his first movies, and it was the one that started Argento's career. And you can see why. And it was the movie that jump-started the giallo craze in the 70s. Because giallo cinema started in the 60s with Mario Bava. He did The Girl Who Knew Too Much and Blood and Black Lace, and he did a few more. Umberto Lenzi did a few giallo movies in the 60s, and not enough people talk about that. But Argento is given credit for really jump-starting giallo cinema in the 70s with Bird with the Crystal Plumage. The movie has a great opening, and it's one of my favorite openings in giallo cinema. This guy, he's going into a museum, and he sees this woman being attacked. And whoever is attacking the woman gets away. And the killer sets something up so that you know that when you walk into a store or something, you have one door, and then there's another door, and they're both slider doors, and they become locked shut. So the guy is trapped in there. So he's seeing this woman bleeding to death before him, and he can't do anything to help her. He can't call the police because it's the 70s, there's no cell phones, and he's trapped in there. And he's, you know, trying to figure out a way out of there, and it's a very suspenseful opening, and the movie just gets better from there. Because this guy then tries to find out who attacked this woman. Like most giallo movies, you have a person witnessing a murder, and then they try to solve the murder. But you get very atmospheric, very well shot, and it has everything you expect in a giallo movie. You have gloved hands, you have one of the most common weapons used in a giallo movie is a cutthroat razor, and you see that a lot in giallo cinema. I would love to see a cutthroat razor come back in a modern horror movie. You know, like a modern slasher movie where a guy goes around killing people with a cutthroat razor just because they're really cool. I have a cutthroat razor at my house, and my brother got it for me for Christmas, and I've been afraid to use it because it's, I just like doing it. Anyway, tangent, I apologize, but anyway, when it comes to, you know, a giallo cinema, my favorite weapon in giallo movies is a cutthroat razor, and you get plenty of those in Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and I'm intending to, in the next couple of months, review Dario Argento's entire Animal trilogy. Because his first three movies were Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Cat o' Nine Tails, and Four Flies on Grey Velvet. And I'd love to review all those three back-to-back pretty soon, but I'll let you know when I'm going to do that. So, but anyway, highly recommend Bird with the Crystal Plumage for anybody getting into Italian exploitation. So anyway, those are my choices for 10 movies for people just getting into exploitation cinema. I hope you guys found this video informative. I hope you found it enjoyable. I hope I've recommended some movies that you haven't seen. If you have seen them, I hope you enjoyed them. But I just wanted to make this video because I thought it would be fun, and I thought it would be good to hopefully let you guys in on some exploitation movies that you haven't seen, and give you a little rundown of what exploitation cinema really is. But on that note, leave a comment down below on if you're an exploitation fan, some movies you would recommend to newcomers to the Grindhouse and Exploitation Cinema. Let me know some of your favorite exploitation films. If you can, and I know this is a lot, but like the list I have, if you could maybe pick your favorite movie from each genre that I recommended, that would also be fun too. But, you know, you can comment whatever you want. As always, thank you all so much for the continued support on this channel. And thank you for watching, and thank you for listening to me ramble on about horror. I really like doing these horror talks, and I have a few ideas for a few more episodes, but if there are any episodes you like to see, leave them in the comments down below. But until then, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely day, night, whatever. Hope you all have a fun summer, and this is the Maniac here to remind you that the Grindhouse will never die. I think we need to end this video with a fluffy dog.
I see. Whoop. I see. He was a good girl. Hey, look up here. Hey. Oh, there she goes. Sadie! He's a good girl. Hey, Sadie.